If you have done the same work for 10, 20, or even 30 years, there is a very good chance modern culture does not understand you. Society looks at your timeline. It sees the years, it sees the repetition, and then it reaches a conclusion. You got comfortable. You stopped growing. You lacked the ambition to leave. In a world obsessed with reinvention, staying in one place is often treated like a failure. The person who changes careers every few years is celebrated. The person who stayed is questioned. But what if that's completely backwards? What if the years you spent staying were not years of stagnation at all? What if they were years spent building something that constant movement makes impossible? Because something fascinating happens to people who stay long enough, and it happens in 3 distinct stages. The first decade teaches you something most people never learn: patterns. The second decade teaches you something even more valuable: people. And if you stay long enough to reach the third decade, you develop something modern culture almost never talks about: perspective. 3 stages, 3 invisible transformations. And by the end of them, you often see the world very differently from the people who spent those same years constantly starting over. Let's begin with the first 10 years, because this is where everything starts to change. Psychologists who study expertise discovered something fascinating. Experts don't simply know more than beginners. They actually perceive reality differently. A chess grandmaster doesn't analyze every piece separately. That would take too much effort. Instead, the board appears as a collection of familiar patterns. Their brain instantly recognizes relationships and possibilities that beginners completely miss. Researchers call this pattern recognition, and it appears in almost every profession. A veteran teacher can often tell which student is struggling long before the report card reveals it, not because the teacher is guessing, because they've seen that pattern hundreds of times before. The quiet student, the sudden drop in participation, the subtle change in behavior. The pattern appears before the evidence does. And after 10 years, this begins happening everywhere. You stop seeing isolated events. You start seeing patterns. Problems no longer feel random. Mistakes become familiar. Outcomes become easier to predict. The world still looks chaotic to everyone else, but you begin noticing that many situations follow the same script. The customer who ignores the warning signs, the employee who is about to quit, the problem that looks small today but will become enormous 6 months from now. You have seen these stories before, not once, hundreds of times. And that's what modern culture misses. It looks at 10 years and sees repetition. What it misses is learning. The first decade wasn't teaching you how to repeat a task. It was teaching your brain how to recognize patterns. But here's the interesting part. Pattern recognition isn't the biggest thing those years create, because if you stay long enough, something even more important begins to happen. You stop learning the work, and you start learning people. Around the 20-year mark, many workers experience a shift. The profession is no longer the most interesting thing in the room. Human nature is. You begin noticing that every job eventually becomes a front row seat to human behavior. A mechanic may spend 20 years fixing engines, only to realize he spent 20 years watching people ignore small problems until they became expensive emergencies. And that's not really a lesson about engines. It's a lesson about people. How often we postpone discomfort. How often we convince ourselves that tomorrow will be a better time to deal with today's problem. How often we ignore warning signs because facing them feels inconvenient. The same lesson appears everywhere. Different profession, same human nature. After enough years, you begin noticing that people are surprisingly predictable. The technology changes, the tools change, the language changes. But the fears remain familiar, the insecurities remain familiar, the hopes remain familiar. Most people believe they are experiencing completely unique problems. The long-term worker knows better, because they've watched similar stories unfold hundreds of times. You begin understanding confidence, fear, trust, denial, resentment, cooperation. You start recognizing them before anyone says them out loud. And this creates a different kind of wisdom. Not academic wisdom, observational wisdom. The understanding that human beings change much more slowly than the world around them. And that's why experienced people often seem calmer. Not because they know everything, because they've seen enough. They've watched today's crisis wear yesterday's clothes. They've watched the same mistakes return under different names. They've learned that many things which appear new are actually old patterns repeating themselves. But even understanding people isn't the deepest lesson, because after enough years, something changes again. And this final shift is the one modern culture misunderstands most of all: perspective. If you stay long enough, you stop collecting information. You start collecting perspective. By 30 years, you've seen cycles, economic booms, economic crashes, management trends, corporate restructurings, promises, disappointments, predictions that never came true, certainties that turned out to be wrong. You've watched enough of life to know that most things are temporary. A manager who has survived multiple corporate overhauls often discovers that many revolutionary ideas are simply old ideas with new vocabulary. The names change, the presentations change. Human behavior rarely does. This is where psychologists talk about something called crystallized intelligence. When we're younger, we rely heavily on fluid intelligence, the ability to think quickly, adapt rapidly, solve unfamiliar problems. But as we age, another form of intelligence becomes increasingly valuable. The accumulated judgment built through decades of experience, not knowledge, judgment. The ability to recognize what matters and what doesn't. The ability to remain calm when everyone else is panicking. The ability to distinguish temporary noise from lasting reality. The ability to trust your own observations. And perhaps that's the greatest gift those years provide: self-trust. Early in a career, every decision feels uncertain. You constantly wonder whether you're making the right choice, whether you're missing something important, whether someone else knows better. But after decades of testing your judgment against reality, something changes. You no longer need constant reassurance. You've been right enough times to trust yourself. You've been wrong enough times to understand your blind spots. You've accumulated thousands of pieces of evidence about how the world actually works. And that confidence cannot be downloaded. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be accelerated. It has to be earned. Slowly, one experience at a time, 1 year at a time. And that's why modern culture often gets people like you completely wrong. Society looked at your years and saw someone who stayed. What it missed was what those years were doing to you. The first decade taught you patterns. The second decade taught you people. The third decade taught you perspective. And somewhere along the way, those lessons became wisdom. You were never standing still. You were building a way of seeing, a way of understanding, a way of recognizing what matters. And in a world constantly chasing the next thing, that kind of wisdom has become surprisingly rare. Before you go, I want to ask you something. How many years have you worked in the same profession? And what is one thing you understand today that you could never have understood in your first year? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.